She negotiated with Colombia's most dangerous cocaine suppliers while wearing Chanel. She coordinated multi-million-dollar shipments across the Pacific Ocean from luxury penthouses. She moved through elite social circles in Mexico City by day and managed international drug operations by night. And yet, in a world dominated by violent men, she became something they could never be: invisible, untouchable, and absolutely essential. This is the story of Sandra Ávila Beltrán, the woman the world would come to know as the Queen of the Pacific, the only woman to ever reach the upper echelons of Mexico's drug trade, the broker who connected Colombian cartels with Mexican distribution networks, the sophisticate who proved you didn't need an army to build an empire, you just needed access, intelligence, and the ability to navigate a world where one wrong move meant death. Born into cartel royalty, raised in criminal luxury, and destined for power that most women in her world could never imagine, this is how she rose to control one of the most crucial positions in the international cocaine trade, and how the life of opulence she built came crashing down in a single moment. October 11, 1960, Mexico City. While most girls born on this day would grow up dreaming of normal futures, careers, families, ordinary lives, Sandra Ávila Beltrán entered a world where normal didn't exist. She wasn't born into poverty that drove people toward crime. She wasn't born into desperation that made trafficking seem like the only option. She was born into something far more dangerous. She was born into cartel royalty. Her uncle was Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, a name that should send chills down anyone's spine who knows Mexican drug trafficking history. Felix Gallardo wasn't just any trafficker. He was the godfather of the Guadalajara Cartel, the organization that essentially created the blueprint for modern Mexican drug trafficking. He was the architect who brought together fragmented trafficking operations into one cohesive, powerful network that would eventually spawn the Sinaloa Cartel, the Tijuana Cartel, and the Juarez Cartel. This was Sandra's uncle. This was her family. From the moment she could understand language, Sandra was surrounded by a world most people only see in movies. Traffickers weren't distant criminals she read about in newspapers. They were family members at holiday dinners. Protection wasn't something you called the police for. It was provided by armed men who worked for her relatives. Money wasn't earned through traditional jobs. It flowed from operations that moved tons of marijuana and cocaine across borders. And most importantly, silence wasn't just a virtue in her family. It was survival. Imagine growing up in this environment, while other children in Mexico City were learning about their parents' office jobs or businesses. Sandra was absorbing the unspoken rules of a different world entirely. She learned which conversations happened behind closed doors. She learned which questions you never asked. She learned that wealth could appear from nowhere and men could disappear just as quickly. But here's what made Sandra different from the children of other cartel figures, particularly the boys, who would grow up to become the violent enforcers and plaza bosses we know today. She was paying attention to the logistics, not the violence. She wasn't interested in being a sicario or a plaza boss. Those positions required brutality, constant warfare, short lifespans. Sandra was observing something else entirely: the networks, the connections, the business relationships that made everything possible. By the time she was a teenager, Sandra had already internalized lessons that most MBA students never learn. She understood supply chains before she could define the term. She grasped the importance of relationships in business, even if that business happened to be international cocaine trafficking. She recognized that in a world of violent, ego-driven men, there was power in being the person who facilitated connections rather than demanding territory. Her family connections gave her something invaluable: credibility and access. In the cartel world, trust is everything, and trust is earned through blood. Sandra had that blood. She didn't need to prove herself through violence because her last name did the work for her. She didn't need to prove herself through violence because her last name did the work for her. When she spoke, people listened, not because she threatened them, but because rejecting someone with her family connections could have deadly consequences. But Sandra was smart enough to know that family connections alone wouldn't be enough. She needed to make herself useful, valuable, essential, and that's exactly what she set out to do. Unlike the men in her family's world who built their reputations through violence and territorial control, Sandra built hers through a different kind of power. She became indispensable as a connector, a facilitator, a broker between worlds that didn't naturally intersect. The late 1980s and early 1990s were transformative years for Mexican drug trafficking. The Guadalajara cartel was fracturing after her uncle's arrest. The Sinaloa cartel was emerging as a dominant force. Colombian cartels, particularly Medellin and Cali, needed new routes into the United States as their Caribbean pathways became too heavily monitored. Mexican organizations needed reliable cocaine supplies to meet growing American demand. This created a perfect opportunity for someone like Sandra, someone who could navigate both worlds, who understood Mexican cartel politics through her family connections, but could also present herself as sophisticated, trustworthy, and professional enough to deal with Colombian suppliers, who were often more businesslike than their Mexican counterparts. For Sandra, the cartel world wasn't an option she chose. It was the environment she was raised in, the only world she truly knew, and the place where her particular skills could make her wealthy and powerful beyond most people's imagination. Here's where Sandra's story becomes unlike any other woman's story in cartel history, and unlike most men's stories too. She didn't enter the drug trade through violence. She didn't build a reputation by eliminating rivals or controlling territory. She did something far more sophisticated and ultimately more powerful. She became the person who made deals happen between people who couldn't afford to trust anyone. In the male-dominated world of drug trafficking, most positions were filled through violence, loyalty proven through bloodshed, and power maintained through fear. Sandra operated in a completely different space. She wasn't a shooter or an enforcer. She didn't command sicarios or control plazas. What she commanded was something potentially more valuable. She commanded access. Her role evolved into coordinating large-scale cocaine shipments between Colombian producers and Mexican distributors. But to understand how sophisticated this actually was, you need to understand the complexity of international cocaine trafficking in the 1990s and early 2000s. Colombian cartels controlled the production. They had the coca fields, the processing labs, the chemists, and the initial product. But they needed pathways into the United States, which consumed the vast majority of their product. Mexican cartels controlled those pathways. They had the border infrastructure, the corruption networks, the distribution systems within the United States. The problem was trust. Colombian traffickers had been burned by Mexican partners who took shipments and never paid. Mexican traffickers had been burned by Colombians who provided low-quality product or shorted shipments. Everyone was paranoid, everyone was armed, and everyone knew that business disputes in this world got settled with bullets, not lawyers. This is where Sandra became invaluable. She could speak both languages, literally and figuratively. She understood the Mexican side through her family connections and decades of exposure to that world. She learned the Colombian side through careful relationship building, probably starting with lower-level connections and working her way up as she proved reliable. She wasn't running corners or managing street-level distribution. She was running conversations between the most powerful criminals in the hemisphere. She was facilitating introductions that led to shipments worth tens of millions of dollars. She was solving logistical problems that could make or break entire operations. Imagine the scenario. A Colombian supplier has 2 tons of high-quality cocaine ready to move. A Mexican organization has the routes to get it across the US border and into American cities, where it can be sold for an enormous markup, but they don't trust each other. They've never worked together. They're in different countries, speak different languages, operate under different codes. Sandra walks into this scenario and changes everything. She knows people on both sides. She can vouch for both parties based on her reputation and connections. She can facilitate the meeting, help structure the deal, coordinate the logistics, and ensure payment flows properly. And for this service, she takes a percentage, usually a significant percentage given how valuable her role is. This was her genius. She didn't need an army of sicarios because she wasn't trying to control territory. She didn't need to be the most violent person in the room because violence wasn't her tool. Her tools were relationship management, discretion, reliability, and the ability to solve complex logistical problems that others couldn't. The Pacific Ocean became her domain, hence the nickname that would define her legacy, the Queen of the Pacific. While other traffickers focused on land routes through border towns like Tijuana, Ciudad Juarez, and Nuevo Laredo, Sandra specialized in maritime trafficking routes. Cocaine moved by cargo ships hidden in legitimate freight. It moved by fishing vessels that looked like they were just working normal Pacific routes. It moved in shipping containers that would blend in among thousands of other containers moving through ports every single day. This maritime trafficking was more complex than land routes. It required more sophisticated coordination, more technical knowledge, more legitimate-looking cover operations, but it also offered advantages. Less direct law enforcement scrutiny than border crossings, ability to move larger quantities in single shipments, more flexibility in landing points along thousands of miles of coastline, and this is where Sandra excelled. Coordinating these complex, high-value operations that required precision, patience, and extensive networks of corrupt port officials, shipping company employees, and cartel members who could handle receiving shipments. Her nickname, Queen of the Pacific, came from this role in maritime trafficking operations. She wasn't just a participant. She was reportedly one of the most important facilitators of these Pacific routes, the person who could make connections happen that others couldn't. Now, here's an important clarification that matters for credibility and accuracy. Sandra was not the boss of the Sinaloa cartel. She was not running the entire operation or making strategic decisions about cartel policy. The media sometimes portrayed her as having more direct control than evidence suggests she actually had. What she was, based on available evidence from her case and law enforcement investigations, was an independent high-level broker. She worked with top figures in various organizations, likely including people connected to what became the Sinaloa cartel, but she wasn't under their command structure. She was a valued contractor, an essential facilitator, someone they worked with rather than someone who worked for them. This distinction matters because it explains both her power and her survival. She didn't have the target on her back that comes with being a cartel leader. She didn't have rivals trying to kill her to take her position, because her position wasn't about controlling territory, it was about relationships and trust, things that can't be taken through violence. Sandra didn't control armies, she controlled access. And in the drug trafficking world, controlling access to reliable suppliers, trustworthy transportation networks, and discrete payment systems can be just as valuable as controlling armed men. Her operations were sophisticated. Law enforcement would later describe her involvement in shipments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She allegedly helped coordinate deliveries that brought tons of cocaine into Mexico for distribution northward into the United States. And she did all of this while maintaining a public persona that was completely at odds with her secret life. This wasn't some street-level dealer trying to act rich. This was a woman actually living at the highest levels of society, funded by profits from one of the most lucrative illegal enterprises in human history. If you saw Sandra Ávila Beltrán at a high-end restaurant in Mexico City, at a luxury resort in the Caribbean, or shopping in Paris, you would never guess you were looking at one of the most connected drug traffickers in the world. And that was exactly the point. While male cartel leaders often flaunted their wealth in ways that drew attention, golden guns, exotic animals, ostentatious parties, Sandra understood that true power in her position required discretion paired with unmistakable quality. She lived an extremely lavish lifestyle, but she wore it like someone born to it, which in many ways, she was. Let me paint you a picture of how the Queen of the Pacific actually lived, because this is where her story becomes visually stunning, even as the source of her wealth remains morally reprehensible. Sandra was known for her impeccable fashion sense. We're not talking about flashy, logo-covered designer pieces that scream for attention. We're talking about haute couture, custom-tailored clothing from the world's most exclusive fashion houses, Chanel suits that fit her perfectly, Hermes bags that cost more than most people make in a year, jewelry from Cartier and other elite brands, pieces that were elegant rather than gaudy. Her appearance was always flawless. hair perfectly styled, makeup applied with expert precision, an aura of wealth and refinement that seemed effortless, but was actually carefully curated. She looked like old money, like someone who'd always had access to the finest things in life. And in a way, that was true. She had grown up around wealth, generated by her family's involvement in trafficking. She knew how the truly wealthy dressed, how they moved, how they carried themselves. She wasn't trying to look rich. She was rich, and she knew exactly how to present that fact. She traveled frequently, and not on commercial airlines when she could avoid it. Private jets became her preferred method of movement, allowing her to cross international borders with minimal scrutiny while enjoying luxury that most people will never experience. Imagine stepping onto a private aircraft, being served champagne before takeoff, flying wherever you wanted, whenever you wanted, with complete privacy and comfort. Her properties were equally impressive. While exact details of her real estate holdings are difficult to verify, she was smart enough to use shell companies and front names to hide ownership. Reports suggest she maintained luxury residences in multiple locations across Mexico. These weren't just nice houses. We're talking about properties in elite neighborhoods, penthouses with ocean views, homes with extensive security systems, pools, and amenities that represented pure indulgence. She drove expensive vehicles, or more accurately, was driven in them. High-end cars that matched her sophisticated image, again chosen for quality and discretion rather than flash. A luxury Mercedes or BMW rather than a gold-plated Ferrari, if you understand the distinction. Her social circles included Mexico's elite. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of her story. She managed to exist in legitimate high society while simultaneously running international drug operations. She attended exclusive events, maintained relationships with people from business and social elite circles, presented herself as a successful businesswoman. And technically, she was a businesswoman, just not in any legitimate sense. The money that funded this lifestyle came through complex financial networks, shell companies that appeared to run legitimate businesses, front operations that generated paperwork showing legal income, money laundering schemes that cleaned drug profits into seemingly legitimate wealth. Millions of dollars flowing through these systems, allowing her to live like royalty, while the source of her money remained obscured. But here's what separated Sandra from the stereotypical image of drug dealers. She wasn't flashy on the streets. She wasn't posting photos with guns and stacks of cash on social media, though social media wasn't the factor in the 1990s that it is today. She wasn't making public spectacles that would draw law enforcement attention. She was untouchable behind closed doors, living a life of incredible luxury that was visible to those in her social circle, but didn't create the kind of public profile that would make her an obvious target for investigation. The Queen of the Pacific understood that the best way to enjoy drug profits was to spend them in ways that looked legitimate, mixing with people who would never suspect her real source of income. Her lifestyle also included constant security, though again, more discreet than the armies of bodyguards that male cartel leaders often employed. She likely had people whose job was to ensure her safety, to monitor potential threats, to provide early warning if law enforcement or rivals started getting too close. But this security would have been subtle, professional, not the obvious armed guards that draw attention. The contradiction of Sandra's life was stunning when you really think about it. By day, she was a sophisticated woman of means, indistinguishable from other wealthy women in Mexico City's elite circles. By night, or more accurately, in her secret business life that ran parallel to her public persona, she was facilitating cocaine shipments that would fuel America's drug epidemic, destroy lives, and generate violence across multiple countries. She compartmentalized these two realities in ways that most people couldn't imagine, negotiating a multi-million-dollar cocaine deal in the morning, then attending a charity gala that evening, coordinating with Colombian suppliers about shipment logistics, then shopping for designer clothes as if she didn't have a care in the world. This wasn't just about enjoying luxury, it was strategic. The more legitimate she appeared, the more she could operate in plain sight. The more she fit into high society, the less likely authorities were to suspect her of being deeply involved in international drug trafficking. Her sophistication was both genuine and a form of camouflage. But as with all things in the drug trafficking world, this life of luxury came with an expiration date. Because no matter how sophisticated your operation, no matter how careful your security, no matter how well you blend into legitimate society, eventually, law enforcement catches up. Or your partner's mistakes expose you. Or someone close to you becomes the weak link that brings everything down. For Sandra, that moment came in 2007, and it came from a direction she might not have fully anticipated. Juan Diego Espinoza Ramirez, known in the drug world as El Tigre, the Tiger, was Sandra's romantic partner and business associate. He was a significant trafficker in his own right, connected to major cocaine operations. And in 2007, his luck ran out in the most final way possible. Espinoza was killed in a confrontation with authorities. The exact circumstances of his death are less important than what happened after. His death exposed communications, connections, and operational details that law enforcement had been trying to uncover for years. When authorities investigated Espinoza's death and seized his phones, computers, and documents, they found threads that led to Sandra. Wiretaps were initiated, surveillance was intensified, financial records were subpoenaed, and slowly, investigators began building a case against the woman who had managed to operate in the shadows for so long. For someone who had successfully maintained operational security for years, who had avoided the kind of high-profile mistakes that brought down other traffickers, this must have been devastating. She hadn't made the critical error her partner had, or more accurately, his death had made him vulnerable in ways he couldn't be while alive. The investigation likely revealed communications between Sandra and Colombian suppliers, financial transfers that were hard to explain through legitimate business, travel patterns that coincided with known drug trafficking operations, testimony from cooperating witnesses who could place her at meetings or discussions about drug shipments. Law enforcement across multiple agencies, Mexican Federal Police, DEA, and others, coordinated to build their case. And when they finally moved to make their arrest, they chose their moment carefully. September 28, 2007, Mexico City. Sandra Ávila Beltrán was taken into custody in an operation that made international headlines almost immediately. Because this wasn't just another drug trafficker being arrested. This was the Queen of the Pacific, one of the few women to ever reach the upper levels of international drug trafficking, being led away in handcuffs. The images from her arrest shocked people around the world, though probably for the wrong reasons. Instead of looking like the hardened criminal many expected, Sandra appeared calm, composed, and well-dressed even in custody. Her demeanor wasn't that of someone who'd been violently dragged from hiding. She looked more like a businesswoman who'd been inconvenienced, maintaining her dignity even in the worst moment of her life. Media coverage was immediate and intense. Newspapers and television news programs across Mexico, the United States, and internationally ran stories about La Reina del Pacifico, the beautiful woman who'd allegedly moved millions of dollars in cocaine, the sophisticated socialite with secret cartel connections, the femme fatale of the drug world. Some of this coverage bordered on sensationalism. There was an element of fascination, perhaps even admiration from some quarters, that would never be extended to male cartel figures. The media seemed almost captivated by the contradiction she represented: beauty and criminality, sophistication and violence, femininity and power in a masculine world. But beneath the superficial media narratives, Sandra was facing very real legal consequences. Mexican authorities charged her with organized crime offenses related to drug trafficking and money laundering. The evidence against her included financial records, intercepted communications, and testimony from cooperating witnesses who described her role in facilitating cocaine shipments. For the first time, the world saw the face behind the whispers. The woman who'd operated so successfully in the shadows was now completely exposed. Her photograph on front pages, her name in headlines, her past and activities being dissected by journalists and investigators. In Mexican custody, Sandra maintained her composed demeanor. Unlike some traffickers who break down when arrested or immediately start trying to negotiate cooperation agreements, Sandra reportedly stayed relatively quiet, maintaining that she was a legitimate businesswoman being persecuted for her family connections rather than her own actions. This defense was always going to be difficult to sustain given the evidence, but it spoke to her intelligence that she wasn't making the mistake of talking too much or making admissions that could strengthen the case against her. The legal process moved forward, and Sandra was convicted in Mexico on drug-related charges. But her legal troubles were far from over. The United States wanted her too. In 2012, Sandra Ávila Beltrán was extradited to the United States to face federal drug conspiracy charges. This was a significant escalation. Mexican prison was one thing, but American federal prison and the possibility of decades in a U.S. facility was something else entirely. The United States government had been building its own case against Sandra, separate from the Mexican charges. American prosecutors had evidence of her involvement in conspiracies to import cocaine into the United States, conspiracies that violated numerous federal drug laws and could carry severe sentences. When she arrived in the United States to face these charges, Sandra was entering a legal system that's notoriously harsh on drug trafficking cases, particularly cases involving large quantities of cocaine. Federal sentencing guidelines for drug crimes are among the strictest in the world, and defendants with her alleged level of involvement typically face decades in prison. But here's where Sandra's case took an interesting turn that reveals something important about her actual role versus her media-created image. She was never sentenced to life in prison. In fact, her ultimate sentence was far less than what many expected, and significantly less than what other major traffickers have received. Why? Several factors come into play. First, while Sandra had clearly been involved in significant drug trafficking operations, she wasn't charged with violence. Unlike male cartel leaders whose cases include murder, torture, and terrorism charges. In addition to drug trafficking, Sandra's case was purely about moving drugs and laundering money. Federal judges have some discretion in sentencing, and lack of violence can be a mitigating factor. Second, her role as an intermediary rather than a cartel leader mattered legally. Prosecutors could prove she facilitated trafficking, but proving she controlled entire operations or made ultimate decisions was harder. She was essential to certain deals happening, but she wasn't the boss of an entire organization in the way that, say, El Chapo was. Third, and this is where things get murky, there are suggestions that Sandra cooperated to a limited extent. Not full cooperation that would have required her to testify against major figures, but perhaps providing some information that was useful to investigators. This kind of limited cooperation can result in sentence reductions without the defendant becoming a full cooperating witness. The exact details of her cooperation, if any occurred, remain unclear. But what we know for certain is that her sentence was ultimately far less than the life imprisonment that seemed possible when she was first extradited. She served time in federal custody, years of her life spent in American prisons, a dramatic fall from the luxury lifestyle she'd once enjoyed. But eventually, she completed her sentence, and the legal process that had defined years of her life came to an end. Unlike most major cartel figures, Sandra Ávila Beltrán didn't die violently in a shootout with rivals or authorities. She didn't receive a life sentence that would see her die in prison. She survived the legal. Sandra Ávila Beltrán was released from custody and returned to civilian life. This alone makes her story unusual in the world of high-level drug trafficking. Most people who reach her level of involvement end up dead or permanently imprisoned. She managed to survive both fates, but survival came at a cost. The life of luxury she once enjoyed is gone. The sophisticated social circles she once moved through are closed to her, The power and influence she once wielded have evaporated. She's no longer the queen of the Pacific. She's a former trafficker trying to exist in a world that has moved on without her. There are no confirmed reports of Sandra returning to drug trafficking after her release. At her age, with her legal history, and with the intense scrutiny she would face from law enforcement in any jurisdiction, a return to that life would be extraordinarily risky. It would almost certainly lead to rearrest and much harsher consequences given her prior convictions. Instead, Sandra has largely disappeared from public view. She avoids media interviews and public appearances. There are no social media accounts broadcasting her current life, no magazine profiles or documentary participation. She has essentially vanished into quiet civilian existence. This disappearance is strategic. Any public profile would bring renewed attention from law enforcement, from journalists, from people in the drug world who might have grudges or scores to settle. Staying out of the spotlight is her best chance at living peacefully. But one has to wonder, what does life look like for someone like Sandra now? How do you go from facilitating multi-million-dollar cocaine deals to civilian obscurity? How do you process the years lost to prison, the lifestyle lost to conviction, the power that evaporated the moment handcuffs closed around your wrists? These are questions Sandra hasn't answered publicly and probably never will. Her story ends not with violence or drama, but with quiet disappearance into whatever life former cartel queens live when their reign is over. Unlike most cartel figures, Sandra Ávila Beltrán didn't die violently. She disappeared quietly. And perhaps that's the most fitting end for a woman who spent years operating in the shadows, powerful but invisible, essential but unknown to most of the world. Sandra Ávila Beltrán's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the drug trade, about gender, about power, and about the systems that create people like her. She was born into a world she didn't choose, raised in an environment where drug trafficking was normalized, surrounded by role models who were criminals. Did she ever have a chance at a legitimate life? Or was her path always going to lead into the drug trade because that was the only world she truly knew? She used her intelligence and sophistication to build power in a male-dominated criminal enterprise, proving that women could navigate that world successfully. But should we celebrate that as some kind of feminist achievement? Or should we recognize that her success came at the cost of countless lives destroyed by the cocaine she helped traffic? She lived a life of luxury that most people can only dream of: private jets, designer wardrobes, penthouses, and elite social circles. But that luxury was built on a foundation of addiction, violence, and death. Can beauty and sophistication make those origins more palatable, or does it actually make them more disturbing? She survived where most cartel figures die or face life imprisonment. She's free now, living somewhere quietly. Her story known, but her current existence unknown. Is that a happy ending, or is it just a different kind of prison? Freedom haunted by everything lost and everything done to achieve power that ultimately meant nothing. Sandra Ávila Beltrán was many things: sophisticated, intelligent, powerful, connected, wealthy, but at her core, she was a facilitator of one of the most destructive trades in human history. She helped move cocaine that fueled America's drug epidemic. She profited from addiction and death. No amount of beauty or refinement changes that fundamental reality. The Queen of the Pacific reigned for years in the shadows, more powerful than most people realized, more essential to international drug trafficking than anyone suspected. But queens can fall, empires can crumble, and sophistication offers no protection when the law finally catches up. Her story is a reminder that the drug trade isn't just violent men with guns. It's also sophisticated networks, complex operations, and people smart enough to facilitate the movement of billions of dollars in illegal drugs across borders and oceans. Sandra proved that women could reach those heights just as well as men. Whether that's a victory or a tragedy depends on your perspective. But what's undeniable is that Sandra Ávila Beltrán carved out a unique place in cartel history. The beautiful, sophisticated Queen of the Pacific, who moved cocaine with the same ease that she moved through elite social circles, who negotiated with killers while wearing designer clothes, who built an empire of access in a world of violence. She's free now somewhere, living whatever life former queens live. And the Pacific Ocean still carries ships across its waters. just as it did when Sandra was coordinating cocaine shipments from Colombia to Mexico. The trade continues, the violence continues, the addiction continues. But the Queen? The Queen has disappeared into the quiet obscurity of civilian life. Her reign over, her legend secure, her current existence a mystery she'll likely never reveal.